G'day from Sydney. I'm Mark Parnell. I'm a design manager at Atlassian, and I want to talk to you today about consistency. Just a wee self-intro first. I currently manage a design team working on a new product for software engineers called Compass. I've worked for many years now designing tools for development teams, and prior to that, I've done design work across the world, from China to India to Turkey. Now, outside of work, my Instagram is now filled with wonderful nature pictures. Unfortunately, for many of you, the nature I've chosen to photograph is spiders. Here I am getting up close and personal with a golden orb weaver. Before I get onto the main topic, though, I want to share some of the lies I was told growing up. First of all, I think we were all misled by picture books as children, cruelly, I'd say, into thinking xylophones and zebras would be a much bigger part of our adult lives. Sadly, it's all too rare that I find myself playing a xylophone while riding a zebra. Then, later, my grandmother convinced me that if we opened a can of Ghostbusters 2 branded tie-in drink, an actual ghost would jump out. This led to such fear that the merest hint from my grandmother of opening the can would terrify both my sister and I. She was an interesting woman, my grandmother. And then there's the lie that this was ever a good haircut for me to have had, but then that was a lie I mostly told myself. But one of the more insidious mistruths over the years has been the need to always be consistent with your design work. In this talk, I want to examine just how consistent we should be, and where a quest for consistency can lead us to make poorer design decisions. Being consistent is, in informal language, held up to be a virtue. Whilst most agree that a few people are consistently bad, Martin Shkreli springs to mind, being inconsistent is the preserve of the cheat and the hypocrite, a defect of the morally suspect. So it goes with design, and often rightly so. It doesn't take most people long to think of design inconsistencies that baffle, offend, and madden in equal measure. When I think of inconsistency, the following things pop into my head. The first example is turn indicators in cars. This is an example of an inconsistency across an industry. In some cars, usually European or American, the left-hand stalk controls turn indicators. Yet in other cars, typically Japanese or Korean, the right-hand stalk controls indication. This lack of consistent standard means trips in unfamiliar hire cars can be a frustrating battle of accidentally turning the wipers each and every time you want to turn. Another example, then, like many of you, I love nothing more than grouping objects in software, whether in Figma or Keynote or Photoshop. Alas, doing this is often harder than it needs to be. Most macOS apps, from Figma to Sketch to Photoshop to Mural to Affinity, use the simple Command-G shortcut to group a set of objects. Keynote stubbornly resists this simple pattern and uses the shortcut Option Command-G. This leads to much irritation as I hammer Command-G to see nothing get grouped, and instead Keynote uselessly tries to find next. Other times, inconsistencies exist in simple visual differences. Take swipe actions on iOS. In some apps, they just have text. In others, text and an icon. And in others, still they have different labels. Minor. But when you first notice this, it seems that a lack of care was taken to keep the interface consistent. Inconsistency, then, is bad. And it doesn't take much reflection to think of the many ways in which a great experience is delivered by a consistent use of elements and controls. Again, taking the first examples that spring to mind. The navigation bar across Google Workspace apps provides a consistent experience with just the right amount of flex, meaning you always know how to navigate within and between apps, but the elements of the navigation bar are optimized to the specific app you're in. Looking at macOS and iPad shortcuts, the same keyboard shortcuts can be used on both Mac and on an iPad keyboard, making moving between the two effortless. And an example from our own work at Atlassian. The Jira issue type icon and issue key provide a powerful visual shorthand that a user is looking at a Jira issue, whether it's represented as a list item, a card, a link, or as a full page. And so the list goes on. Here's another example, signage systems. Through a consistent system of visual identifiers, colors and terminology, signs, whether in airports, metro lines, or on the roadside, relay information much more quickly through their consistency. Here, for instance, is a set of Australia's road signs. As with other signage systems, it's helpfully and thoughtfully consistent. But now let's suppose that high on the achievement of creating such a successful and consistent set of signage, a crazed sign designer decided to mandate that all roadside signs must conform to the visual standards that they have defined. Thus, even building or house signs and even advertising must use the same pattern. In this world, a nice cozy house sign would end up in the same format, and advertising would end up similarly consistent. Mission accomplished, we are consistent. But of course, in extending consistency beyond reasonable sense, we've ended up with the worst design outcome. We've lost many of the specific, idiosyncratic goals that the two pieces of signage had, either to express something homely and charming about a house, or to sell the many virtues of Vegemite. Worse yet, we now have many similar-looking signs, some carrying critical information, others mere house names or adverts. And even if our maniacal sign designer mandates that house signs and adverts be a different color, this doesn't do much to reduce the monoculture or remedy the first problem. In short, consistency is not and cannot be the sole criterion of good design. Building a consistent design system is important, but overzealous quests for consistency can be at the expense of other aspects of design. The example I've given so far is a bit of a thought experiment, but this isn't only a hypothetical problem. Let's take Google's recent redesign of the icon system for Google Workspace. It's great in many ways that a more consistent set of icons was introduced. But the downside is that every icon is now one of an almost identical set of rainbow boxes and blobs, indistinguishable from one another at first glance, and thus harder to discern between. As one Reddit user put it, they blend into a sea of colorful boxes. Now, we may not wish to side with the pitchforks that are drawn whenever a major app makes bold changes, as we know that feeling all too well. Still, it's clear from this example that there are at least some downsides to focusing on consistency too much. Looking at my own work at Atlassian, I can see a number of times when this has been true. First of all, working many moons ago on a product called Jira Ops, a product to help developers deal with outages, I designed an incident timeline feature to be consistent with the comment view in Jira software, reasoning that being located in the same place meant I should follow the same design language to a T. Here's the Jira Ops timeline. And for reference, this is the comment view in Jira. You can see how similar it is. In hindsight, I probably over-optimized for consistency and failed to consider the ways in which a stream of incident events is different to a comment feed. Namely, that there are typically far more timeline events than comments, and that large indicators for showing the app or user that triggered an event are less important than optimizing for high information density for a busy developer responding to an outage. And thus, when we have revisited the incident timeline in other Atlassian products, such as Ops Genie here, we still use our Atlassian design guidelines, but in a denser format that better serves the needs of incident responders. Another example then is from our new product, Compass, where we are designing cards to structure information on the screen. Our initial design used a format for a card that captured a performance score, and this was something that users would need to appraise and understand at a glance. In the course of iteration, the team veered towards a design that did away with this different layout and ensured greater consistency across the cards, but at the cost of the score being easy to comprehend at first glance. Thankfully, the team moved back to the earlier design, but again, the quest for consistency led us to miss other important design considerations and put us at risk of worse design outcomes. To understand how this can happen, let's return to some foundational concepts. The importance of consistency in interface design has been understood for a long time, with one of Jakob Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics being consistency in standards. Users should not have to wonder whether different words, situations, or actions mean the same thing. Follow platform and industry conventions. He then adds, people spend most of their time using digital products other than yours. Users' experiences with those other products set their expectations. Failing to maintain consistency may increase the user's cognitive load by forcing them to learn something new. In doing this, Nielsen goes on to highlight the need to maintain both internal and external consistency. That is, consistency with your tool or product family and consistency with wider industry conventions. First, it's here that we see how that Apple keyboard shortcuts example from earlier on came to pass. Apple's keyboard shortcuts are internally consistent, and Command G will find next across all macOS apps. But this is at the expense of being consistent with wider industry patterns, such as using Command G to group. Now, should we optimize for internal or external consistency then? I think Jared Spool is right when he argues that this is the wrong question. Instead, he argues that we should rather be thinking about the current knowledge of the user, because when you think about consistency, you're thinking about the product. When you're thinking about current knowledge, you're thinking about the user. They are two sides of the same coin. So perhaps consistency isn't the right focus. It's just one part of a user's current knowledge. He goes on to add that his team have noticed that designers who spend more time thinking about their users are the ones that end up with more usable designs. Now, I would also add to this the importance of also thinking about the user's current goals. That is, not just thinking what does the user currently know, but also what are they trying to do. To go back to our card example, we need to optimize not just what the user knows about how cards look, we also need to optimize for user goals that making critical scoring information more prominent can support. The idea of user knowledge and goals driving our consistency provides a strong model in the face of objections. Take, for example, learning curves. Raluca Budiu, citing research literature, argues in terms of learning curves, and that the learning curve for novel, inconsistent interfaces will be harder than for old, consistent ones, as shown in the graph here. However, much of the challenge of consistency isn't with like-for-like tasks, where learnability from prior tasks will help drive action. The danger lies in taking patterns from one context and overextending them to another context where they are less relevant. It's less a matter of, do I swap the button order arbitrarily in different dialogues, and more, should I swap the button order in this unique scenario that is totally unlike the other times we lay out buttons? In such cases, users might not even recognize that the pattern you're providing is or isn't consistent with one from somewhere else. Remember that there is a difference between consistency as you, the designer, sees it, and consistency as the user experiences it. And to understand how the user sees it, one must think in terms of their goals and knowledge. And so, learnability isn't really the primary concern when we talk about overextending consistency. Coming back to Jared Spool, he goes on to state, why do we gravitate to consistency? Because it's easier to think about. You don't actually have to know anything about your users to talk about making things consistent. You only have to know about your design, which most designers are quite familiar with. I'd say this is correct, but I don't think it's just a matter of consistency being easier to think about. Another problem I've noticed, time and again, in myself and in others, is that the goal of creating a consistent design system comes to displace the goal of creating an effective, usable interface for users. Creating a consistent design system is both important and, as those working on the Atlassian design system can attest, often wickedly hard. And yet, such a design system is merely a tool to deliver better experiences to our users, namely by increasing internal consistency. I think, as designers, there is often a mental trap we fall into as we start to create components in a tool like Figma. We think our goal is to nurture a perfect design system, a system where every piece of typography is the same, where every component has the same states, with the same colors and the same terminology. As we design, exceptions multiply, but we almost see these as a threat to the logic of our designs, and so find ways to shoehorn them into the existing system instead of evolving what we have designed and building in more flexibility to support unmet user needs. Now, using Figma, I'd recommend being bold in branching your design system files to explore iterations, new variants or changes that best meet the needs of users in your unique use case. I think it's also wise to be thoughtful about what gets added to your global design system. If your design system covers multiple products, experiences, or apps, not everything featured in every product needs to be part of the design system. Some components will be novelties that cover a specific use case in a specific app or scenario. It's better for the design system to deal in atomic pieces that can be reconstituted into novel experiences instead of featuring complex patterns that leave little room for variance. An example of this from Atlassian are Jira's sprint boards. They're not part of our global design system, but a pattern that we have componentized for Jira. Other products either don't have boards or, as in the case of Trello, benefit from a different approach to the idea of a board. Adding a complex interface to our global design system would be much too specific and prevent other products, such as Trello, from delivering an interface that best meets their users' needs. To come back to Spool's point once more, I think we have come to ask the wrong question about consistency because of the almost moralistic way our design education teaches us to think about consistency as being inherently virtuous. We'll often hear in design critique, Y is inconsistent with X, being called out as a failing of a piece of design work that needs to be defended. This is instead of more considered questions around the best way to match user knowledge and to meet user needs being asked. The danger is when our design must be consistent becomes what the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton calls a thought-terminating cliche. That is, when a commonly used phrase is deployed in discussion in a manner that looks like an argument or some folk wisdom, but actually shuts down rational discussion. Phrases such as damned if you do, damned if you don't, now is not the time exemplify this, as do conspiracy theorists when they say trite things like trust the plan. Instead of examining the sort of consistency we should be optimizing for, internal, external, visual, functional, or whether consistency really helps us meet user needs in a situation, it suggests that we unthinkingly remove any identified inconsistencies because consistency equals good. Instead, we should, at the risk of using another fatuous cliche, come to think of consistency as another tool in our toolbox to deliver effective, usable experiences. Sometimes an internally consistent experience will be the best way to match user knowledge and help users achieve their goals. And sometimes an externally consistent experience will be the answer. And sometimes something totally novel will be the best solution instead. Having said this, we must balance optimizing for user needs and knowledge in every interaction with ensuring that we have some level of internal and external consistency. The outcome should not be totally different interfaces and patterns and styles for every interaction. And we also need to factor in the development cost of inconsistency. Consistent, reusable designs result in consistent, reusable code. All of this stands to underline my point, however. Consistency is one of a set of things that we may consider and optimize for when making design decisions, and excessive, reductive focus on any one factor can lead to worse outcomes. Indeed, to circle back to one of my earlier examples, there are probably very good reasons for the swipe actions across iOS apps being inconsistent. Sometimes a swipe action outright deletes an item. Sometimes it merely removes it from a list, hence the different language. Emails and lists tend to be much taller than most other list items, hence the use of an icon and text, in this case, to better fill the space. The general pattern of a swipe and then some color-coded actions is consistent, but the designers balance the design by considering more things than just consistency to deliver a better experience for that situation. To stick with iOS for a moment, another important reason to break consistency at times is to move beyond incremental improvements to bigger experience gains. Now, whilst the rollout of Safari 15 was at times rocky, we know that from simple reachability that placing key controls at the bottom of the top of a mobile interface is suboptimal. Therefore, moving the address bar down, though inconsistent with the user's prior experience of Safari and with their experience of most other mobile browsers, may have considerable usability gains. If we obsess too much over consistency, we will never find these gains. Happily, Atlassian's own design principles recognize the reality of this. One of our principles is match purpose and feel familiar. Our products are individually fit for purpose, as well as collectively harmonious with each other, as well as other products that people use. Although there's a persistent visual and behavioral similarity, they adapt to people's devices and context rather than being consistent for the sake of consistency. It then goes on to add, Are we balancing the expectation that learned behaviors will carry across products with the need to adapt appearance and functionality to be more effective? I think this is a good principle for everyone to hold. To summarize then, with consistency, as with all things, the poison is in the dose. Moreover, consistency is not virtuous in and of itself. It's a core design principle that's essential to delivering a great experience to users. Taken too far or in an overly reductive manner, it can displace serving user needs with building a consistent system just for the sake of it. So the next time you fret about consistency in yours or another design or another's designs, ask instead what the user knows and what they are trying to achieve, and then discuss what measure of consistency best helps us achieve those goals, and if this case warrants a little inconsistency. As long as the inconsistency is internal, it may well be justified. This might not look as good lined up in our Figma files, but will help us to better support our users. And that's it from me. Here are all the ways you can get in contact with me, and otherwise, good luck being consistent out there.